You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Cinna. A European Union ban on importing Iranian crude oil has taken effect. The ban is part of a move by Western countries to force Iran into stopping its nuclear programme, which the West fears is for weapons development. The EU embargo was imposed as a reaction to a report last November by the International Atomic Energy Agency, spelling out the evidence of past research by Iran in nuclear weapons design. So far, sanctions on Iran have not forced the country into making concessions on its nuclear programme. In fact, Tehran has demanded that sanctions end before they will curb uranium enrichment. Iran has pledged to counter the impact of an EU oil embargo, saying it had built up £95 billion in foreign reserves to protect itself. Well, joining me to discuss the Iranian oil embargo is The Guardian journalist Saeed Kamali Dehghan. Dr. Mamdouh Salameh is an international oil economist and consultant to the World Bank on oil and energy. David Patrick Karakos is the author of the upcoming book Nuclear Iran, The Birth of an Atomic State. And Andrei Baklitsky is the project director at the Russian Center for Policy Studies. Dr. Mamdouh Salameh, the sanctions have so far brought Iran to the table, but will the West accept anything other than a total climb down by Iran?
The West wants Iran to abandon its nuclear program, particularly if it is, as rumored, aimed at getting nuclear weapons. However, the sanctions have hardly affected the Iranian economy. In fact, I would go as far as to say that the sanctions worked into the hands of Iran, because Iran has managed to save more than $20 billion in subsidies for refined products. You remember that Iran used to import 50% or 200,000 barrels of gasoline and other refined products. With the sanctions, Iran was forced to abandon that. So what they have done, that gave them the way to remove the subsidies, and the prices, of course, have gone up, albeit it added to the inflation, but it saved them paying $20 billion in subsidies. Consequently, I would go as far as to say that the sanctions will not bring Iran to the negotiating table to give concessions. Iran will go ahead with its nuclear program, whether it is with sanctions or without.
David Patrick Karakos, Dr. Salameh is saying that the embargo might be biting at the Iranian economy, but it's not going to cripple it and it's not going to bring Iran to the table at all. Do you agree?
I wouldn't agree with that, no. A lot of what you said was absolutely correct. However, I think that Iran has already been brought back to the negotiating table, and I think that sanctions and increased diplomatic pressure has in large part, facilitated this. From the end of 2009, just after the October Geneva meeting, between bilateral talks between the USA and Iran, until April 2012, when Iran met the P5+1 in Istanbul, Iran didn't meet with the P5+1. I mean, it sort of tried to put together a deal with Turkey and Brazil, but it didn't feel that it needed to meet. It continued on. It smashed through a technological barrier in 2011, enriching to 20%. And now it is in the most sustained period of engagement that we have seen for 2 years. So I do think Iran is feeling the pressure, and it is back to the negotiating table.
Sorry, Dehghan, Iran is back at the table. Do you agree?
Yeah, partly yes. I think that sanctions have affected to some extent. I don't think that it's necessarily going to change Iran's view about its nuclear program. And I think the true victims of sanctions would be the people of Iran, but it has affected Iranian economy. The inflation has gone up, the prices of food staples have gone up. It's definitely affecting people, but not to an extent that, as David said, it's not crippling Iranian economy. It's just making life difficult for people. Iranian economy is not, it doesn't work in the way that the Western economy works. The rulers in Tehran are mainly concerned about preserving their authority and power rather than being concerned about the quality of life inside the country.
Andrei Baklitsky, project director at the Russian Center for Policy Studies, Saeed Dehghan, said that you know, prices have soared because of these sanctions. You've seen sugar prices go up, you've seen food prices go up. Who is really being affected by these sanctions?
Well, it's not really easy to tell who is most affected by the sanctions, but as my colleagues have already stated, Iran is back to the table, so there should be some good reason for them to come back after the couple of years of silence. And not it's only the sanctions that do not permit them to sell their oil, for example, but they're also under other severe pressure. For example, Iranian banks have been disconnected from the SWIFT system. It's an international system of banking transactions. And they are not really, they cannot really use their banking system normally at the moment. For example, when they're selling oil to China, and they are selling it in China's currency, and of course with yuan you can only buy from China. That's another issue. And the third issue is that there is always a threat of preemptive strike, either from the Israeli part or from the part of the Israeli leading coalition or United States-led coalition. And that's one of the reasons, I guess, why Iran is not abandoning the talks, because once you close this option, there's only one left. So Iran is still under huge pressure, if not only for economy.
Sure, we'll come back to the Israel side of the sanctions later. Dr. Salameh, you wanted to come in here.
Yeah. Iran is playing a very shrewd game with the West and the global community. They negotiate, but one thing you could be sure of, Iran will never relinquish its program for peaceful use, because they need electricity generated by a nuclear plant to replace the oil and gas they are using now, which amounts to around 600,000 barrels of oil, so that they can add it to their exports. As if they have any chance, or if they have any plans of acquiring nuclear weapons, they have law on their side and they have logic. They look around and they say, why the West is putting pressure on us when Israel, Pakistan, India and North Korea have nuclear weapons? Either you are even-handed or you are not. With that in mind, the logic is on the side of Iran, and I am projecting now as an expert that Iran will look down and face down the United States, Israel and the European Union, and will get away with its nuclear program and possibly with nuclear weapons as well.
David Patrikarakos, Dr. Salameh is saying that we need to be even-handed across all states. Can we really be like that with Iran?
I would take issue with one thing you said. You said Iran has law on its side. It quite simply doesn't, because Iran signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. I take on board the doctor's points about a certain amount of double standards. However, it must be remembered that Israel, India, Pakistan didn't sign the NPT. Iran did. And it signed it willingly and voluntarily. In fact, it signed it the day it opened for signature in 1968. So I do think that there is a certain double standard, sure, but Iran is legally bound not to proliferate. And let's not forget that it is the one that says time and time again, we are not interested in nuclear weapons. It says that itself. So I don't think that it has law on its side. If it were to proliferate, it would signal the death knell of the NPT, which I think would be a very bad thing indeed.
Do you think the sanctions so far are powerful enough to force a change of policy on uranium enrichment?
What is certain is that these sanctions are unprecedented, and Iran is feeling the strain. Whether or not they are enough to make Iran change its mind, nobody knows. What is interesting is that I used to speak to many Western diplomats, and they used to regale me with stories about Iran's ability to stall, to delay diplomacy and move on with enrichment, with, it must be said, a certain amount of begrudging awe on occasions. I think what we're seeing now, in fact, is the P5+1 begin to stall. The offers they put to Iran, the last couple of meetings, were very poor. Iran was always going to refuse them. So why not make an offer that Iran could accept? I think what the P5+1 is doing now is stalling, putting in low offers that Iran isn't going to see the pressure mount up, to see just how big a price Iran is willing to pay for its uranium enrichment.
A reminder that you're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Cinna with today's discussion on the Iranian oil embargo. Joining me is The Guardian journalist Saeed Kamali Dehghan. Dr. Mamdouh Salameh is an international oil economist and consultant to the World Bank on oil and energy. David Patrick Karakos is the author of the upcoming book Nuclear Iran, The Birth of an Atomic State. And Andrei Beklitsky is the project director at the Russian Center for Policy Studies. What do you think needs to be on the offer for Iran to accept it? So far, is it just the West that expects Iran to just be the one that is constantly compromising, and there seems to be nothing coming from the West?
Well, at the moment, yes, but let's not forget the West has bent over backwards over recent years. They offered Iran fuel swaps, they offered Iran a complete enrichment service coming out of Russia where the fuel would be imported into Iran. It really did bend over backwards. I think the game has changed now. I think there's a feeling that sanctions are biting, that Iran is becoming under increasing pressure. Let's not forget its own economic woes. 30 years of economic incompetence have really left the country in a pretty dire state.
Saeed Dehghan?
I agree that it was not appealing to the Iranian authorities because it didn't have any sanction relief. It had, it was mainly based on three parts. It was mainly the embargo that the West had on the airplane parts, repair parts was going to be lifted, and the other two parts which were not very appealing to Iran. What Iran wanted was partly a bit of relief on the sanctions from the West, that it was not on the table. If Iran had relinquished all its 20% uranium, then there was nothing on the table for them as a bargaining chip in future, so that they can rely on to negotiate. If they had given away all the 20% uranium, I think they didn't have anything else to negotiate in the future, and they were not sure that if they had anything as a bargaining chip so that they can put pressure on the West in terms of whole sanctions being lifted. I think some people have seen the West offer as shoddy a bit, and I think I agree with it, not entirely, but I think in overly, I think I agree with that the West offer was a bit shoddy because it didn't have any sanctions relief.
Andrei Beklitsky, project director at the Russian Center for Policy Studies. Saeed Dehghan has said that the West's compromises weren't very good. They didn't offer any sanctions relief at all. What do you think of the West's offer that they presented in Moscow, and what do you think needs to be done, and what do you think they need to offer in order to get a climb down by Iran at least some way?
There's a little bit of imbalance at the moment because Iran is asked to abandon the part of its enrichment program and to stop enrichment till 1975%, which is doing at the moment. And then it said that he might get some sanction relief later on. So that's clear that Iran is not really willing to go for that. But there was an interesting piece of information 5 days before the last round of Moscow talks. Iranian Vice Admiral stated that Iran is planning to develop nuclear submarines. It went mostly unnoticed, but to build a nuclear submarine, you have to have a highly enriched uranium. And it would still be a peaceful use of highly enriched uranium because you use it only to power the nuclear submarine to move. So, and basically you don't even need to build one, you just start development and then you have the pretext for enriching uranium even further. So at the moment when it was announced, the majority of non-proliferation community thought that, so this might be the bargain. So Iran is saying that, look, we can still further enrich it to say 60, 80, 90%, still being peaceful. So this is our deal. We will not do this. We will not enrich it further, and you will leave something. So there could be a bargain that Iran can play with. But it's clear that Iran should be throwing something more on the table.
Dr. Salameh, international oil economist and advisor to the World Bank. Two Western diplomats have told news agencies that at the recent talks in Moscow, Iran didn't come to the table with anything that would have given the six powers enough to negotiate with. They didn't come to the table with the offer of the suspension of 20% enrichment. Andrei Beklitsky has also said that Iran hasn't come to the table with enough for any other powers to accept. Why isn't Iran not offering anything substantial at the table?
That they are playing a very shrewd game. They have no intention of giving any concessions to the West or anything. They are going ahead with their nuclear program, thirst for peaceful use, but Iran is not averse to acquiring nuclear weapons. So they don't care. They will look down, or they will face down, as I said, the global economy, the Americans, the Israelis, and the European Union, and they will go ahead with their nuclear program. The sanctions are not affecting them. And we must remember, history teaches us a lot.
The sanctions have affected the rial. That's halved, and also the prices of food and sugar and fruit and other staple items are really affecting the Iranian people.
Yeah, but it might be affecting, but the Iranians can always shift the blame on the United States and the European Union by saying, well, we didn't cause the price rise. What caused it is the sanctions. So politically, they are immune to any trouble inside Iran.
But the sanctions are working then. You've just accepted that.
Sanctions, a bit of inflation is neither here nor there.
It is for the people. It is for the people of Iran.
Still, they have enough dollars in banks to buy whatever they need. The question is, sanctions have never worked before. And I give you an example. Saddam Hussein's Iraq, despite the most intrusive sanctions against Iraq, he was able to earn $1 billion from smuggled oil. Iran is far bigger than Iraq, and it is open to many countries which don't kowtow to the United States, especially the ex-Soviet republics.
Sure. Let's bring in David Patrikarakos here, writer, essayist and journalist, and the author of the upcoming Iranian book. The sanctions are not going to affect Iran, according to Dr. Salameh.
I don't believe that the Islamic Republic government is politically immune from the sanctions. I think what you've seen in Iran, especially after the 2009 fraudulent elections, is a splintering of the Iranian elite, which was faction-ridden anyway. Now Rafsanjani, former President Rafsanjani, who uses any opportunity now, who lost the power struggle following the 2009 elections, takes any opportunity to attack Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, especially over the sanctions. He said in a speech last year to the Assembly of Experts that whenever we try and find a loophole around the sanctions, the Western powers block it. We mustn't forget, for example, that former nuclear negotiator Ali Larijani resigned, citing irreconcilable differences with Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, saying that Iran's diplomacy was bringing far too much isolation to the country and that it needed diplomacy, even though he didn't obviously move at all. He was firm on Iran's right to a nuclear program. A few years ago, the government could sell the program to its people as a totem of Iranian achievement under threat from an imperialist, colonialist West. But I think those days are gone. I think Iranians are getting a bit sick and tired of the nuclear program, and well, not in and of itself, but the problems that are being brought about by it. So I don't think it's politically immune by any means.
Saeed Dehghan.
Yeah, I think this rivalry inside, this top-level rivalry inside the regime is also very interesting. We remember that when former President Khatami, the reformist, was in place, it was a time that for the first time Iran agreed to stop all the enrichment and allow in the UN inspectors. And then what we are seeing now is that nuclear negotiation and the people behind it are mainly people close to the Supreme Leader and the Revolutionary Guards, which are relatively hardliner in comparison to the previous team under Khatami. Even President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad is no more in control of the negotiation. Saeed Jalili is a very close ally of the Supreme Leader. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad and his government, we can almost say that they have no role in the current negotiations about Iranian nuclear program. And this is all because of this internal rivalry between Ahmadinejad team and the Khamenei team. And in your first question about whether Iran was in negotiating mood when it went to Moscow, I think Iran, at the same time it wanted some sanctions relief, it didn't even ask for it. In Moscow, when we had from diplomats what was going on privately and what was going on the negotiating table, we understood that there was nothing from Iranian side about sanction relief, although they publicly made it outside the negotiating tables. They said it before negotiating and then after it, but they didn't mention it when they were there. But they were mostly emphasizing on the rights to nuclear enrichment, which they made it very bold.
A reminder that you're listening to the Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Cinna with today's discussion on the Iranian oil embargo. Joining me is the Guardian journalist Saeed Kamali Dehghan. Dr. Mamdouh Salameh is an international oil economist and consultant to the World Bank on oil and energy. David Patrick Karakos is the author of the upcoming book Nuclear Iran, The Birth of an Atomic State. And Andrei Baklitsky is the project director at the Russian Center for Policy Studies. Andrei Baklitsky, I just want to bring you in on a key area here. Russia's main concern is that Iran's nuclear and missile activities are going to push NATO countries to support this anti-ballistic missile defence system in Europe, which Russia will fear that will eventually make their nuclear deterrent null and void. How concerned should Russia be with these negotiations?
I wouldn't really say that Russia, that's the only reason that the United States are building their new anti-ballistic missile system in Europe, because when asked, the United States diplomats, when they were directly asked if Iran stops its nuclear program, if there is no threat from Iran, would you dismantle your anti-ballistic missile system? And their answer was, well, no, we will not. Because at the moment, as you probably know, there are talks about that Syria is a threat with its weapons and its chemical weapons, and so on and so forth. So the basic idea of the anti-ballistic missile shield in Europe is to shield Europe from anything. So it doesn't really matter if Iran has nuclear weapons or doesn't, has it missiles or doesn't. There's such an idea that it might be something in the future. So this anti-ballistic missile defense system is more for the future than for the present, not really affecting anything. Russia has its also problem with nuclear Iran because not as United States or Britain, Russia is bordering Iran through the Caspian Sea, so nuclear weapon Iran is not in interest of Russia. But neither Russia is interested in a military operation against Iran, which would flood the region with the people living in Iran and will destabilize hugely the region. And also Russia has a lot of economic interest in Iran, so it wouldn't like Iran to be destroyed as a state, as we've seen, for example, in Iraq and neighboring states. So there is a general idea that there should not be war in the region. And starting from this premise, Russia also says that yes, we don't need nuclear Iran. So it goes in both directions: no war, but no nuclear Iran. And in between, Russia tries to find some ways to negotiate this or other issues.
Dr. Salameh, how far do you think Russia is going to go in backing these sanctions? They have got economic interests in Iran, but they do not want a nuclear Iran with nuclear weapons because of the way that the two countries border.
Russia will try to comply with the sanctions to some extent, but it will not do anything to antagonize Iran because, as you rightly mentioned, they have mutual interests together. And they are neighboring countries as well. But we come back to the original point. If you want to force Iran into relinquishing its nuclear program, you have to be even-handed. And there is no proof except they are enriching uranium, and everybody knows that he who masters the technology to enrich uranium will never stop there, because nuclear weapons give a country more status and it protects its interests. And we have seen that in the case of Iraq, if Iraq had nuclear weapons, the Americans would not have dared to attack it.
David Patrick Karakos, this isn't going to do much to settle Israel's fears. How far do you think this has got to go until Israel will say, look, enough is enough, we have to launch military strikes against Iran's nuclear facilities? Do you think it would even go and launch an attack on the Iranian sites?
I think this question comes down to not so much a desire, but the capability. I'm not sure if Israel logistically can strike the Iranian reactors. Now, everybody cites the 1981 strike on Osirak, the Iraqi reactor, as a precedent. But in fact, it's a precedent in showing the difficulties of what Iran has to do. Iran decentralized its nuclear program on the Iraq precedent. Iran is a lot bigger country than Iraq. It's further away from Israel. Its facilities are dispersed in a country far bigger than Iraq, underground. I'm not entirely sure that Israel can logistically smash the Iranian reactors facilities rather. And I think this is part of the reason that we saw an upsurge in assassinations, as Israel looked for alternative ways. Stuxnet, for example, the assassination of Iranian scientists, of trying to halt Iranian progress. I think the window is gone. I think if Israel could have wanted to do it, it's missed the opportunity. There's some talk that perhaps it might do it in September before the American elections, but I just think it's too difficult now.
Dr. Salameh, do you agree with that? Is it too late now for Israel to attack, or do they even have the capability to attack?
Not only too late, it has always been a huge bluff so that Israel can get more concessions from the United States. And consequently, I don't see any military action against Iran. And who knows, they might acquiesce eventually to Iran having nuclear weapons. And who knows, there might be an unholy alliance between the United States, Israel and Iran to siphon off the oil and energy resources of the Arab Gulf. So that's where I see it leading. And Iran has much lower proven reserves as they claim, and their consumption inside the country is going so high that within few years I am projecting that they will become a very minor exporter of oil, and they look with envy across the Gulf to the riches of the Arab Gulf with smaller population and huge amounts of oil, and they hope that if they have nuclear weapons, they will be the policeman in the Gulf as they were under the Shah, but with nuclear weapons where they can share in the riches of the Arab Gulf.
As we come to the end of this discussion, I just want to hear from all of you about what you think it will take to get both sides to be happy. We'll start with Dr. Salameh.
The West will have to acquiesce to Iran's nuclear program, and Iran will go ahead with it whether they agree or not.
Saeed Dehghan.
I think the West should continue dialogue with Iran, and it should do anything possible to avert any possible war or any military strike.
David Patrikarakos.
I agree. Diplomacy is the only way forward. War is just an unthinkable catastrophe for all concerned.
And Andrei Baklitsky.
I guess the mutually acceptable scenario would be Iran having an enrichment program, but enriching till 3.5% and using it only for its nuclear power plant under the NPT and full safeguards, and lifting sanctions at the same time. So probably something like that.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. Thank you to all of my guests, the Guardian journalist Saeed Kamali Dehghan, Dr. Mamdouh Salameh, the international oil economist and consultant to the World Bank on oil and energy, David Patrikarakos, the author of the upcoming book Nuclear Iran, The Birth of an Atomic State, and Andrei Baklitsky, the project director at the Russian Center for Policy Studies. Force Iran into stopping its nuclear program, which the West fears is for weapons development. The EU embargo was imposed as a reaction to a report last November by the International Atomic Energy Agency, spelling out the evidence of past research by Iran in nuclear weapons design. So far, sanctions on Iran have not forced the country into making concessions on its nuclear program. In fact, Tehran has demanded that sanctions end before they will curb uranium enrichment. Iran has pledged to counter the impact.
Because Iran has managed to save more than $20 billion in subsidies for refined products. You remember that Iran used to import 50% or 200,000 barrels of gasoline and other refined products. With the sanctions, Iran was forced to abandon that. So what they have done, that gave them the way to remove the subsidies, and the prices, of course, have gone up, albeit
Sanctions have so far brought Iran to the table, but will the West accept anything other than a total climb down by Iran?
The West wants Iran to abandon its nuclear program, particularly if it is, as rumored, aimed at getting nuclear weapons. However, the sanctions have hardly affected the Iranian economy. In fact, I would go as far as to say that the sanctions worked into the hands of Iran.
Of an EU oil embargo, saying it had built up £95 billion in foreign reserves to protect itself. Well, joining me to discuss the Iranian oil embargo is The Guardian journalist Saeed Kamali Dehghan. Dr. Mamdouh Salameh is an international oil economist and consultant to the World Bank on oil and energy. David Patrick Karakos is the author of the upcoming book Nuclear Iran, The Birth of an Atomic State. And Andrei Baklitsky is the project director at the Russian Center for Policy Studies. Dr. Mamdouh Salameh. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Cinna. A European Union ban on importing Iranian crude oil has taken effect. The ban is part of a move by Western countries to